Chapter 7. Knowing Death. The next few days passed quickly as they traveled through the mountains still surrounded by dense forests. The next leg of the journey took a week, and each day, in accordance with their bargain, the prince was given a new freedom. The first day, as promised, the exiles allowed him to go about the journey with the hood of the overlarge, fetid brown cloak lowered. They also removed his gag. That wasn't part of the deal, he protested. How else are you going to warn us of impending doom? The girl asked, her tone breezy but eyes staring daggers at him. Fair point, he said, and then, taking himself and her completely by surprise, he smiled his biggest, most winning smile, just to make her angry. It worked. She whirled around, threw his reins to Tamaz, swearing and cursing all shadow-born princes, and disappeared into the trees. The prince, half expecting Tamaz to dunk him in whatever body of water happened to be closest at hand, eyed the big man warily, but the giant only shrugged. You both take yourselves too seriously, he said, before mounting his stallion and following in the same direction, the long lead of the prince's mount now tied to the saddle of his charger. As the prince had promised, he made no trouble along the way. All he did, and all he wanted to do, in truth, was look at his surroundings as they traveled through the forest. There are so many, he muttered to himself. He was looking at the trees, noticing all of the different types of bark, the short trees, the tall trees, the wide trees, the trees with needle-like leaves. Near midday they stopped briefly, and both Tamaz and the girl went out looking for whatever it was they used to find their way, leaving the prince alone in a small clearing. Alone, but not truly so, for the prince knew neither exile was far enough away that he had any chance of escape. So he sat there on the horse and reveled in the crisp, clean air, so different from the thick haze of Lucien, and made a vow to himself that once he had received his inheritance, he would make time to come back here of his own volition, just to explore. Pine, rumbled Tamaz. The prince jumped, startled. The big man seemed to have simply materialized behind him. He had no idea how Tamaz, at least when he wasn't mounted on his enormous charger, could move so silently. It was almost like the way guardians, the personal guards of the children and the Empress, moved. At the thought of this bearded, rough-and-tumble giant in the uniform and with the manners of a guardian, the prince couldn't help but smile. Tamaz chuckled and thumped him on the back, thinking they were sharing the same joke, and the prince would have been knocked off his horse had he not still been tied on. This, of course, only made Tamaz rumble chuckle harder, sounding for all the world like a swarm of bees, though the prince's own smile turned into a grimace. No need to fear, little princeling. It's only me. Here, look. He pointed a hand the size of the prince's head at one of the trees. It was a tall one, and it had wide-flung branches toward the bottom that got smaller and shorter as they ascended. It was one of the ones with green, needle-like leaves, and there were quite a few of them around. Pine. It's a pine tree. You can tell by the needle leaves and the smell, as well as the seeds they produce. Pine cones. Tamaz swung his arm to the ground, bending quite dexterously at the waist, and picked up a large brown thing. He straightened, and in the same motion tossed the whatever it was to the prince, who caught it easily despite his bonds. At first he was revolted that the man had given him something that had been on the dirt floor of this forest corridor, and then the revulsion and beginnings of anger evaporated and turned to rueful laughter. The Death Watch had tried to kill him. He was being held hostage by 2 of the exiled kindred. He was living in a constant state of fatigue and hunger. He slept every night on the ground, ate with his hands, and hadn't bathed in over 2 weeks. But apparently what really bothered him was that the big man had tossed him something dirty. If he wasn't careful, by the time he returned to the fortress, he'd be worse than Joffred, who had to have everything cleaned thrice before he'd so much as be in the same room with it. He examined the cone. It was a decent size, perhaps as large as the prince's fist, though it had looked no bigger than a walnut in the big man's hand. It had some spiny bits that he tried not to handle. He looked back up at Tamaz, eyebrows raised, waiting for the rest of the conversation, the true conversation, to begin. But the big man simply smiled pleasantly at him, waiting for a response. For a long moment the prince stared at the big man, and then he looked back down at the pine cone blankly. Was the cone the message? He turned it over in his hands. Nothing. No scrap of parchment, no hidden coding or anything of that sort. Not that he'd expect the big man to be clever enough to come up with something like that, but then why had he handed him the pine cone under the pretense of... And then, slowly, the realization sank in that the big man was talking about nothing more than pine cones. The prince had never had any real companions in the fortress, never had anyone who simply wanted to talk to him because they felt like talking to him. The Most High whom he associated with were fed lies and double talk with their wet nurse's milk, and nothing they did or said was ever to be taken at face value. Anyone else was beneath his station, aside from his brothers and sisters who were even worse than the Most High. Yet here, in the middle of the wilderness, an outlaw was trying to be friendly by teaching him the name of trees. This wasn't a prelude to anything, they were just talking. About seeds and things. He looked back at the big man. One eyebrow quirked questioningly. "Pine?" he asked. He watched Tomas warily, waiting to be mocked for mispronouncing the word or not knowing it to begin with. Such was the way the other children in the Visigony had taught him government, industry, and economics. "Very good, princeling," the giant said with a huge smile, for all the world looking like the proud parent of a precocious infant. His large, square white teeth shone from the thicket of his beard as he pointed at another tree, this one taller than all the others. "Redwood. You can tell by the quality of the bark as well as the height." "Tomas!" the girl called from up ahead. "I need your opinion on something." Tomas reached over and grabbed the reins of the prince's horse, unhooked them from the black charger's saddle, and roped them to a tree trunk. He then swiftly remounted his charger, the prince watching stoically until the big man clapped him on the back. "Hopefully soon, I won't have to do that," he rumbled, and gave the prince another smile, this one small and conspiratorial. "Right," the prince responded, with as much of a smile as he could manage. The big man rode off in the direction of the girl's voice, leaving the prince to stew in his thoughts. That night he went to sleep feeling bold and excited that his plan was working. If they let their guard drop a little more, then by the time they reached Bainland he'd just walk away. He rolled over and closed his eyes. But as soon as he did, a feeling that squirmed in the pit of his stomach like a pod of eels made him queasy, and he was forced to sit up abruptly. He breathed deeply for a moment, and the feeling passed, leaving a strange hollowness in its wake. He lay back down, but sleep did not come to him, and he spent another restless night looking at the stars he never would have seen if he hadn't been forced out of Lucien. As the next few days passed, Tomas continued to give the prince impromptu lessons on the various species of flora and fauna they passed throughout the day. After a while, they even began to strike up a strange kind of conversation that involved various barbed comments at one another. The prince came to realize that this was banter, the kind of friendly conversation that happened between the servants of the fortress. It was strange to him, but his stiff and awkward attempts seemed enough for Tomas, and, as time passed, the prince realized that he liked the big man, and that in another life maybe they would have been good companions. But when he thought that, he felt again the queasiness of the night before, and so he shoved these thoughts aside, reminding himself that he was only using this exile to make his way back to the Empire. He was glad, however, that he and Tomas were making progress, because his attempts to make any kind of amiable connection with the girl were failing miserably. His first attempt had been on the third day after the Death Watchman attack, when he'd noticed the girl trying to lift a log out of the campsite they'd found. Tomas was out scouting the area, and so she was struggling on her own. The prince, seeing his opportunity, came forward as far as his bonds would allow. "Here, let me help, Eshendai," he said, reaching out to grab the other end of the log with his tied hands, using the title that Tomas used in place of her name. Her reaction was so sudden and violent that he would never have predicted it. Within the space of a second, he found himself on his back, staring up from the ground into the girl's face, which was contorted into an ugly mask of righteous anger. "Should you wish to live, you will never use that title again," she said. She had drawn one of her daggers, and the steel bit ever so slightly into his neck, causing a burning sensation. He felt a drop of blood crawl across his skin and fall to the ground. "You misunderstand," he whispered, not trusting himself to speak normally with the gleaming dagger pressed so fiercely against his throat. "I was trying to be respectful. I don't know your name. I meant nothing by it." "Good," she hissed. She pushed herself off of him and disappeared into the trees. She didn't return for almost an hour, and when she did, she pretended he didn't exist. But he remained determined, and his second chance came soon after. It was the first night the prince was allowed to move about the campfire. True, he wasn't completely unbound. His hands were still tied together, though far enough apart that he could use them, and his feet were tied as well so that he couldn't do more than execute a sort of shambling half-walk, but it was progress. As soon as he'd been untied from the horse, he'd set about being helpful. He hobbled the pack horse in a nice patch of grass, as he'd seen the exiles do each night, then began to set a ring of stones for a fire, and finally untied the exiles' packs from their horses. From the pack horse, at least. The charger still wouldn't let him anywhere near it. When the exiles noticed, they commented on it to one another when they thought the prince was out of earshot. He, of course, was very carefully not out of earshot, but he did what he hoped was a decent job of pretending to be.
"He's being helpful,"
rumbled Tomas.
"It's sure changing."
The prince, even though his back was turned, allowed himself not even the hint of a smile as a thrill of triumph coursed through him. He could risk nothing. "No," he heard the girl respond savagely. "He's, at worst, conspiring to kill her in our sleep. At best, imitating us. Trained monkey." The prince almost faltered in the act of retying a saddlebag as anger, white-hot and blinding, roared up into his throat at the insult. Imitating them like a trained monkey, am I? I should strike her down and... No. He calmly tied the bag closed and finished going about the chores that needed doing in order to set up camp for the night, giving no sign that he had overheard a thing. Soon he had everything ready except the fire. He looked around for wood, but there was none, so he was forced to wait for the exiles to finish talking.
"It's been too long since I've had some fresh meat. I'm off to hunt,"
Tomas rumbled suddenly, breaking away from the girl. He reached into a pack tied to his charger and pulled out a sling. Before seeing the big man fight, the prince would have found the sight of the small sling in the hands of the giant quite amusing. Now he thought that a stone from that sling in the hands of that man could kill a full-grown ox at 100 paces. The girl nodded. "I'll get the firewood," she said. "There should be enough around here that I won't have to go far. I'll just tie up the princeling." A thought occurred to him then. A dangerous thought. One he probably should have let go lest he risk everything. But his anger at being insulted spurred him on. "I'll go with you," he said to the girl, doing his best to make it a request and not a command. The exiles paused. Tomas in the act of stretching his right arm, the girl in the act of crossing to the prince in order to tie him to a tree again. "No," she said. "Why not?" "Because I said so. You sound like my mother." A ringing silence descended as that comment, completely unplanned on the prince's part, fell with a thud into the middle of the small clearing. After a few days of learning how to banter with Tomas, the words had just slipped out. There were several beats where no one said anything, and then, in a rumbling snort like the sound a volcano must make before it erupts, Tomas began to laugh. The snort turned into a full-throat guffaw, and then the giant was roaring so hard with laughter that he made the forest and mountainside almost ring with the sound, bright and clear and rich. "Tomas," the girl said, "shut up, you'll give away our position." "I'm surprised they can't see your swollen pride from here," the prince said. The delivery was awkward, and he was relatively sure it wasn't a good joke, but it was at least effective enough that the girl turned bright red, and Tomas doubled over, slapping his knee in mirth. "Tomas," the girl repeated, growling his name. "I mean it." The giant gave a final trumpeting bellow and then was silent as he wiped a tear from his eye, though he still shook with aftershocks of laughter.
"Ah, well," he said. "Sorry about that, Eshendai. I haven't had a good laugh in a long time."
"I don't care," she replied. The prince could tell that she was trying to be taken seriously, but the effect was ruined by the beet-red color that had spread over her cheeks. "We're trying not to be followed, and we can't sacrifice that because you feel like having a good laugh." Tomas shrugged and looked at the prince.
"Is there anybody nearby?"
After a brief moment of confusion, the prince realized the giant was asking him to check the surrounding area for signs of life. He paused for only a second, and then realized that there was no reason not to. He reached out through the talisman as far as he could go, and felt nothing, aside from the strange, static-like background that he was coming to recognize as the muted life of the trees and plants and the simplistic minds of the animals that lived in them. He let the connection slip away, and he opened his eyes to find the big man looking at him. It was strange, being in the company of someone who simply took what he did as a matter of fact, not as something to be feared or worshipped. "No one for at least a mile," he replied. "Probably not beyond that either." "You can't trust him," the girl said angrily. "Yes, you can," the prince shot back, frustrated. For some reason, the fact that she wouldn't trust him when he was actually telling the truth blew on the banked coals of his anger and set him into full blaze. "You'd kill us in our sleep if you could," she spat contemptuously. Something in him snapped. The way she spoke, it was as if she thought that death were nothing to him, as if death itself were nothing. "You have no concept of what it means to kill," he hissed through teeth clenched in a snarl. His vision had gone red around the edges, and his anxiety, frustration, and anger had formed into a hard, twisting fist in his gut. Fury like he had only felt a few times in his life took him over completely. You know nothing of death. You know nothing of taking a life. You perform the act, but it means nothing. To you, it is no more than slicing a thread, trimming a nail. It is no more than dispatching nameless faces. If you knew what I know of death, knew the feeling of being inside a person's mind when your sword cuts through their skin and bone, and their life and mind and body go dark, as the spark that anchors them to this world is smothered and they spin endlessly into space, you would never again speak so lightly of taking a life. I have no desire to know you, and so I have no desire to kill you. How many of the Death Watchmen did the two of you kill? Not the constructs, but the soldiers. 20, did you say? Such a brave exile. I killed one and I nearly lost my mind. I did it out of need, out of base necessity, to continue living. And even then, I knew him, inside and out, as he died. I knew his hopes and dreams and fears, the way he loved his wife, the pride he had in his children, the glowing hope that, even as the steel cut through him, he would live to see them again, to make them proud of how he had served the Empire. Death is emptiness, death is taking, death is the end. So stop accusing me of the willingness to do something I understood better at the age of 5 than you will ever understand in your entire life. Somehow, during the time he had been speaking, he had taken several steps toward her, while she stood rooted to the spot, staring at him. He took another step, and came so close that he was breathing in her face, his midnight black eyes meeting her emerald green. Never speak lightly to me of killing. I am the Lord of Death, for my mother cursed me as such on the day I was born. I know it as you never shall, and my life is tied to it as you should wish yours will never be. He stopped talking and took a step back, his anger spent. He suddenly felt awkward and vulnerable, as if he had stripped and laid himself bare. She stood staring into his eyes, her own very wide and round, and her mouth open in a small O, until she seemed to realize what she was doing. When she did, her eyes narrowed and her mouth snapped closed. She held his gaze still, though, and another minute or more passed that way, with the two of them staring at each other. The prince refused to look away. He had nothing to hide. He had meant every word of what he'd said, even if it made him uncomfortable to be so vulnerable in front of them. Finally, she turned to call back over her shoulder. Tomaz, I think that... But the forest behind her was just trees. Tomaz had disappeared. The prince didn't know when the big man had left, but he was sure somehow that it had been after he had finished speaking. They were silent as they absorbed Tomaz's absence, which made as much, if not more, of a statement as anything he could have spoken aloud. The giant was forcing the girl to deal with what he had already come to understand about the prince. Slowly, she turned back to him. As one, they walked over to the tree closest to the campsite. He waited patiently for her to tie him to the trunk, then sat down as she left to get firewood. He felt a slight pang of regret that he hadn't remained calm, but was also proud that he had finally said something to which the girl had no response. Nearly an hour passed, enough time for the sun to set completely, leaving him alone in the dark, before Tomaz returned with an enormous animal slung over his shoulders, the rack of its antlers nearly large enough to hold the prince's entire body. It had 4 legs and a heavy, deep chest covered in a thick layer of soft gray-brown fur. If the prince had to guess, he'd say it was an elk or a deer, though since he had never seen one outside of a book or a dinner plate, he wouldn't have staked his life on it. One of its eyes was glassy and dead, while the other one was simply missing, a thin trail of blood tracing downward from the empty socket. It would appear the prince had been correct. Tomaz was just as deadly with the sling as he was with his enormous greatsword. As he walked into the clearing, the giant paused. He took in the prince, the noticeable lack of a fire, and the absence of a certain green-eyed girl. The big man grunted and then crossed to the fireless fire pit. With a quick shrug, he lifted the antlered creature off his shoulders and dropped it to the ground, where it landed with a heavy thud. He then crossed to where he had left his greatsword and unsheathed it. Turning, he approached the prince. Shocked, the prince recoiled from the giant, but he was tethered to the tree and in the end there was nowhere to go. The giant raised the sword and the prince closed his eyes. Something tugged at his wrists, and with it came the snick of taut fibers being cut, and the prince was no longer tied to the tree. He opened his eyes just in time to see the sword flash twice more, and the prince, too shocked to move, felt another tugging sensation on both his hands and his feet, and then the fabric parted and slid off, falling to the ground and leaving him free, completely unbound. The giant turned away and sheathed his sword in a single fluid motion, as effortlessly as the prince would do up a button.
"Do you know how to dress an elk?"
Tamaz asked while rummaging around in his pack. "You mean put clothes on it? Why would you want to do that? I was under the impression that you wanted to eat it."
Tamaz snorted and stood up, holding a long, oddly curved knife.
"Here," he said, and tossed the knife unsheathed to the prince. Alarmed, the prince caught the knife by the hilt, almost dropping it in surprise.
"Open the stomach and pull out the insides," the big man said. "Dig a deep hole with this."
He tossed the prince a small, wedge-shaped tool.
"And throw them in there so that we don't get any wolves looking for handouts. Try not to hit any rocks, it's a good spade."
And with that he turned and left, slinging his sword across his back and moving off in the direction the girl had gone, no doubt following her trail, though the prince could never have said how. For a long moment, the prince stood there, unfettered, armed, and alone. He turned his head and saw the two horses cropping the scraggly mountain grass not 20 yards away, and realized he could take one and leave. The exile's packs were there, full of supplies. He could take them and go. No doubt the girl's pack contained the map she'd used, and with that he might be able to chart his own way to Bainland, and... He moved off to the side of the small clearing and began to dig a hole, using the metal triangle, spade, to pull large clumps of dirt out of the ground. It took a few tries to get the hang of it, but it was easy enough, and soon he was making good progress. As he worked, he told himself again and again that the only reason he was staying was that no matter how fast or stealthily he ran, the exiles would catch him again before he left the mountains. He was no woodsman, of that there was no doubt, and he would last barely a day, if that, before they caught him and ruined everything. He needed to wait until Bainland. That was all. So he dug the hole, and when he judged it to be deep enough, he turned and thought about how best to follow the rest of Tamaz's instructions, feeling oddly invigorated by the physical activity, even though it had made him sweat. But then again, with the way he smelled as it was, and with the multiple layers of grime that covered his common's clothing, it didn't really matter. "If only Joffred could see me now," he muttered raggedly, breathing hard as he looked from the hooked knife to the dead animal. Or Tiffinal, for that matter. The thought of the fox trying to maneuver his perfectly manicured fingernails around the handle of the metal triangle, the spade, it's a spade, use its name, to dig a hole was certainly amusing. He bent and stuck the knife into the elk's stomach, doing his best to map out exactly what his plan of attack was. As he went about opening the animal's belly, he found that he wasn't at all alarmed by the sight of the entrails, nor the smell of the blood or the sounds of the knife. He supposed that after seeing what he'd seen and the lives he'd taken, made this seem somehow mundane. The creature was already dead. Working with a body held no horrors for him. It was the living he had trouble with. Sometime later, the exiles returned, the girl looking around anxiously until she saw him by the elk. Tamaz bore a slightly exasperated look on his face and was carrying a load of branches and twigs. The only words that were spoken that night were in reference to the elk and the fire. Tamaz finished the job the prince had begun, which in large part involved pulling out bits the prince had missed and then skinning the creature, before cutting it into large chunks and then strips and hanging it over the fire. Tamaz showed the prince how to wash his hands with water from the waterskins and a cake of hard animal fat soap to remove the blood without getting it all over himself, which the prince found very useful. That night they ate what Tamaz didn't decide to smoke and salt, a process the prince found fascinating. The girl ate only a small amount, while the prince ate ravenously. He hadn't gone more than a day without fresh meat in his entire life, and the recent diet of cheese, edible plants, flatbread, and jerky had left him sated but never full. Tamaz himself ate nearly half the animal, enormous though it was, and looked as though he stopped himself from eating more. When they had finished eating, they all pulled out their blankets and found a patch of ground on which to sleep. The prince and the girl situated themselves on opposite sides of the fire as Tamaz took the first watch. As the prince lay beneath his blankets trying to find sleep, he wondered why he didn't feel any sense of triumph. He felt no anger, no remorse, and also no hope. He felt blank, empty, numb, that was perhaps the best way to put it. The only other time he had described the experience of using the talisman was to his brother Joffred, so that the reaction could be chronicled. He had felt numb then as well, but mostly because he had recently come out of the coma into which the experience had sent him. Now the numbness came from... he didn't know. Was it because he knew Tomas's reaction was out of understanding and sympathy? Perhaps because of the way the girl had looked at him, the way her silence showed she too had an idea, however infinitesimal, of what he went through when he used his mother's gift. He was unbound. He had played Tomas into believing in him, and he had convinced the girl, however unintentionally, to lower her guard, though he knew that she still had not done so completely. He was free to make his escape when they reached Bainland, to find the seeker there and make his way back to his mother. His mother who never would have believed in him the way Tomas did, the way the girl might be beginning to. She's the Empress, he reminded himself. She knows only right and wrong, as should I. The talisman is my gift, and my burden as one of the princes of the realm, and I should wear it with pride. I wear it to serve the Empire. Someday I will be the prince of the 7th Principality, and I will need to deal with exiles such as this without pity. They have broken our laws and turned their backs on civilization. They threaten the lives of the people of Lucien. The prince rolled over and stared at the stars, and suddenly it occurred to him that he didn't know for what the girl and the giant had been exiled. The reason doesn't matter. The Empress has exiled them and all the kindred. That is reason enough and always will be. But the words sounded hollow, and he didn't know why.